Derek Monday has given me 3 subjects, quite unrelated to each other. He asked me to speak on the baptism in the Holy Spirit, but I'm not going to do that this morning. He asked me also to speak on bringing charismatics and evangelicals together. I've just published a book on the subject and put everything I know into the book. And if you do that, you then get asked to speak on the same thing everywhere, so that's tomorrow. But this morning he's asked me to speak on salt and light, which he introduced very briefly last evening. In other words, the influence of Christians on the world. I wish it was all one way. I have the feeling we ought to be discussing the influence of the world on Christians, because that's what's happening to a greater degree at the moment. However, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And in both cases, that is not by saying anything or by doing anything, but by being something. Now that's terribly important. Salt and light are being used fairly freely among Christians at the moment because of the growing emphasis on social action. But neither salt nor light are concerned with social action. They are concerned simply with being something. Salt affects its environment simply by being what it is. And light affects its environment by being simply what it is, not by saying or doing anything. And if we're going to be salt and light, it's not by a lot of talk or even a lot of action that we're going to be salt and light. It's by being totally different from our environment, and so different that we affect it. Now, the context for these statements about salt of the earth and light of the world is the Sermon on the Mount. And the context for that is the Gospel of Matthew. And since every statement in the Bible takes its meaning from the context of the book in which it's placed, we've got to say a little about Matthew. Of the 4 Gospels, 2 were written for sinners and 2 were written for saints. And it's very important when you read a Gospel to know which of the 2 it is. Luke and Mark were written for unbelievers, but Matthew and John are written for Christians. And they are written to remind Christians of the things they need to know. And that is why some of the parables, for example, have a different meaning in the Gospels. In Luke, the lost sheep is a sinner, and you have to go and look for sinners. But in Matthew, the lost sheep is a backsliding believer who must be brought back to church. And so everything in Matthew is geared to believers. It is, in fact, a manual of discipleship. And Matthew has collected all the teaching of Jesus for disciples into 5 blocks or sermons, the first of which we know is the Sermon on the Mount. And these 5 blocks are all about one theme, the kingdom into which we have entered, the kingdom of which we are sons. And the 5 sermons are about the lifestyle of the kingdom, the mission of the kingdom, the growth of the kingdom, the community of the kingdom, and the future of the kingdom. And every bit of those 5 great sermons, if you like, or they're really compilations of things Jesus said on different occasions, every one of those 5 discourses is for disciples. Not a word in them is for sinners. And therefore the Sermon on the Mount is the lifestyle in the kingdom for those who are already in the kingdom. It is addressed not to sinners. It is fatal to preach the Sermon on the Mount to unbelievers. They immediately get the idea that becoming a Christian is doing good. And being kind to grandmother and the cat makes you a Christian. That's the kind of impression that the world has got. And people like Tolstoy and Mahatma Gandhi started their understanding of Christianity with the Sermon on the Mount and finished it there too, which is a fatal misunderstanding. The Sermon on the Mount is for those who have been born again, for those who are in the kingdom, for those who are following Jesus, and it is about how they're to live so that they act on their environment as salt and light. That's the context in Matthew. Now, the context of these 2 sayings in the Sermon on the Mount itself is this. They come immediately after the Beatitudes, what Billy Graham calls the Buddhaful attitudes, and they lead into a restatement of the law of Moses in very much stricter terms than Moses ever realized. And therefore, salt of the earth is a summary of the Beatitudes, and light of the world is an introduction to the commandments that follow. So if you want to know how to be salt of the earth, you read the Beatitudes. But if you want to know how to be the light of the world, you read what follows. And these salt and light sayings are a link between the opening section of the sermon, blessed are such and such people, and the rest of the sermon, which is about morality, a high standard of living. Well, now that puts it in context. So let's begin with salt of the earth. It's very unfortunate that most people don't know Luke's gospel. That is the least known of the four gospels. And I often test a congregation by asking them whether a quotation comes from the Old, New Testament, or William Shakespeare. And the quotation I give them is, if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And then I ask congregations, is that Old Testament, New Testament, or William Shakespeare? And it's very interesting, the result. It's always the minority that get it right. It is what Jesus said as he carried his cross up Calvary. If they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? Now, why don't we know that? Because I'm afraid we don't know Luke's gospel. Apart from the prodigal son and the good Samaritan, Luke is the most neglected gospel. And it is Luke's gospel that tells us what Jesus meant when he said, you are the salt of the earth. Matthew's gospel doesn't define it. It just says, you are the salt of the earth. And that allows the preacher preaching from Matthew by itself to put any meaning he likes into it. And unfortunately, what we do is we put our own experience of salt into the meaning. And our experience is mostly culinary, from the kitchen to you. And so we think of salt as either a flavoring or a preservative. And almost every sermon I've heard on You Are the Salt of the Earth talks about flavoring or preservative, that somehow a little sprinkling of Christians makes the atmosphere sweeter, or somehow we manage to be the museum of society, and we certainly manage to be that. I mean, I ask you, a church that is stuck with Roman togas, that's what the surplice is, and with Gothic architecture and Elizabethan language, art thou with it, and Victorian music, and we try and persuade the world that God is alive in the last decade of the 20th century. We're pretty good at preserving traditions, but that's not necessarily our main task. What then is salt for? And in Luke's gospel, Jesus defines what he means. He says, if the salt loses its saltness, it is no good either for the field or the dunghill. And this tells you what salt was used for in the ancient world. It was scraped up from the shores of the Dead Sea, which, as you probably know, is 28% salts in solution. If you've ever been there, you can sit on the water and read a book. It's so full of salt. And as the sun dries it out, then the salt is left around the edge and it's scraped up and sold. Now, it's not pure sodium chloride, NaCl. It is a mixture of various salts. There are all kinds of different salts there, and one of the main ones is potassium chloride, potash. If you're a gardener, then you know that every plant needs three kinds of fertilizer. It needs phosphate to develop the roots, it needs nitrates to develop the leaves, and it needs potash to develop the flowers and fruit. And a balanced fertilizer will include all those three. And so the salt that was scraped up from the Dead Sea was widely used as a fertilizer, largely because of the potash in it. There were other things too, magnesium bromide. There are all kinds of major salts in the Dead Sea. There is also sodium chloride, quite a lot. And that, of course, was used in the kitchen. But Jesus is thinking about its use as a fertilizer. He said, on the soil. And the word soil there is exactly the same as the word earth in Matthew. The salt of the earth, the salt of the soil. The fertilizer that you put on the soil to make good things grow. And then he mentioned the dunghill. That was a reference. The word there is a word for not animal manure, but human manure. He's now into the backyard. They didn't have any flush toilets or L-sands in those days. They simply had a heap of dirt at the bottom of the yard. You went and emptied your bowels at the bottom of the yard, and then by the side of the dirt was a box full of salt from the Dead Sea. And you put a handful of that on your dirt. And that, in fact, was a disinfectant, a very simple disinfectant to stop the spread of things you didn't want to grow. Now, those two put together give you a negative and a positive influence of salt, that it promoted the growth of good things that you wanted to grow, and it inhibited the spread of bad things that you didn't want to grow. It is a vivid picture. And Christians are to be the salt of the soil. And it's interesting that our word soil again corresponds to both sewage and the ground in which we grow our vegetables and fruit and flowers. So that here you've got a very clear, vivid picture. Jesus was always using very familiar pictures from ordinary life and using them to illustrate profound truth. You are the salt of the soil. You are the people who will stop bad things growing and spreading, and who will promote the growth of good things that are wanted there. Now that's a vivid picture. And you are that salt, not by saying anything and not by doing anything, but by being totally different from the environment. And it's as simple as that. Now, having given you that picture of the purpose for it, there are three profound implications of that. Number one, those two uses require a certain amount of salt, a certain quantity of salt. Now, we'll come later to the need for quality in salt, but the first need is quantity. In the kitchen, a sprinkling will do. A little salt in the soup and that's enough. But as a fertilizer or a disinfectant, you need a considerable amount before the effect shows. You need handfuls in both cases. A little sprinkling on the soil will not do a thing. And therefore, the very concept of being salt in society demands a certain proportion of that society being Christian, being different, being salt. And the simple fact is that in England today we have not got enough salt. It is as simple as that. And that is why social trends are going the wrong way. And there's no way it can be reversed until there is a sufficient amount of salt to do the trick. Do you follow me in this? Now, this is a very important point. In other words, we might be able to win an occasional battle by lobbying and by protesting, but we will lose the war while there is an insufficient amount of salt. And you can apply this in any situation. In Nagaland, for example, you do know where that is, don't you? It's a little bit of India, the other side of Bangladesh, up against the Burmese border. And it holds the record, that's right, you're drawing a little map. It holds the record in the whole world for being 85% of the population born again. And if you go to Nagaland, that is certainly profoundly influencing Nagaland, and the social trends go the right way. When I asked a man whom some of you may have heard speak in this country, Chuba Ao, when I asked him how they managed to get to this stage, with a twinkle in his eye, he said, well, missionaries can't get in. And he said, we are grateful to them for bringing the Bible and the gospel, but then they were thrown out. And so they didn't infect us with their low level of faith. Because I'm afraid the missionaries we send out from this country and elsewhere go with the level of faith in their home church. And frankly, the level of faith in the third world when they have no missionaries is way higher than ours. Way above ours. Which is why the Lord does so many miracles there. But 85%. There are villages in China which are now reaching 3/4 born-again population status. Now, there isn't a community in England that's anywhere near that. And in inner London, the percentage of committed Christians is 0.1% at the highest estimate. That is not enough salt. And while you read the papers and decry what's happening in society, it all shrieks at me, we no longer have enough salt in this country. We once had, but we no longer have. And we can't expect the trends to reverse until we do. Now, how much do we need? Now, this is where I've got some good news for you. We don't need 90%, or even 70%, or even 50%, or 40%. I feel like a man selling china in the marketplace. Not 30%, or 20, or 10, or, for you, 5%. Now, that is an amazing discovery that in fact, when in any community or society there is 5% salt, the social trends reverse for the better. And it's not by anything that 5% are saying or doing, but just by being. 5%. Now, if you ask me how many convinced, committed Christians we do have in England, my guesstimate would be about 2.1%. If we could treble that number, then we'd begin to see a reversal of trends. Now, that is why evangelism, if we're going to reverse the trend in society, evangelism's got to be top of the... Social action's not going to do that. Not saying social action's wrong, but I'm saying it's not going to reverse the trends. Until we are producing enough salt to save a society, we're going to continue to work in a situation that's going downhill. And where, incidentally, it becomes increasingly difficult to be a Christian, because the tide is running hard against us at the moment, and will continue to do so. Well, now that's the quantitative aspect of salt. Sprinkling is no good. We need shovelfuls, and we haven't got them. And while we may make rearguard actions on questions such as Sunday and so on, the war is being lost, even if an occasional battle is won. And that is simply because of lack of salt. The second aspect is the aspect not only of amount, but of distribution. Salt is no use in the box or the salt cellar. It has got to be in direct contact with the dirt before it operates. In other words, it operates by presence and not absence. And as long as salt is locked up in a meeting like this, we cannot be salt of the earth this morning. We just can't do it, because we're out of contact with the dirt. You follow me? And therefore distribution, we need first of all 5%, but if that 5% were all locked up in Christian schools and in suburban churches, it would not be salt. It's got to be in among the dirt. It's got to be in direct physical contact if it's going to operate. Now, we've seen this happen. We had a hospital in Guildford, and the matron of the hospital, that dates it, she would now be the chief nursing executive officer or something, but she was the matron then, and her name was Miss Underdown, and she left the hospital to marry the chairman of the hospital board, whose name was Mr. Tickle. And I'm so relieved I didn't have to conduct that wedding. I couldn't have done it. Could you marry Miss Underdown to Mr. Tickle? But anyway, before she left, she sent for me, and I went to her office, and I was intrigued why she should send for me. I'd never met her. And she said, before I leave, she said, I want you to thank your church for all that they've done for this hospital during the 10 years I've been here. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm at a loss. We had organized nothing for that hospital. We didn't take carol services. We didn't raise money for them. We'd done nothing. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. She said, during my 10 years, my work has got easier and easier. She said the relationships among the staff have improved. The relationships between staff and patients have improved. She said, it's noticeable. And she said, I've tracked it down, and it's due to members of your church. And I remember going home and looking through our lists of members and so on, and I reckoned about 7% of that hospital were in some way in touch with the church. But she'd noticed it. And it wasn't anything we had done, but the salt was acting. Do you understand me? I've seen it happening on estates. When you get an estate where 5% are committed Christians, it'll change for the better. The gardens will be tidier, the children will play happier. In a factory where there's a 5% Christian presence, the language changes without anybody saying anything. See? Now, I hope that's set before you a bit of hope as well. Think of your street or the place where you work. Don't grumble because you're in direct contact with the dirt. That's precisely where salt can act. But it does need a 5% presence. And there is a disturbing attitude among Christians to try and get out of that dirt and to get into a Christian situation. I have mixed feelings about Christian schools. Because sooner or later those kids are going to be in the dirt. And I would rather they were in it while they're still at home and within reach of their parents and can work out the problems with them. But there we are, that's just a personal reflection. But I remember a girl coming to me and saying, isn't it wonderful? She said, I'm the only Christian in the office where I work. And she said, it's so hard. But she said, I've seen an advertisement for a Christian firm and they want someone and I'm qualified for the job. And I've been accepted in a Christian firm. And she was looking forward to starting the day with prayer and all the rest of it, and going to work in a firm where everybody was Christian. And she saw my face and she said, what's the matter? I said, well, two things are the matter. First, you will find out it's not the promised land to be working with Christians. If you think it's heaven working with Christians, you've got an awful shock coming to you. I see that many of you identify. To dwell below with saints you know. No, what is it? To dwell above with saints you love, that will be glory. To dwell below with saints you know, that's another story. But I said, secondly, you just told me that you were the only Christian in the office where you worked. And now they have no contact with Jesus. See? I want that to be an encouragement to some of you to stay right where you are. Or to put it in Bible terms, to remain in the vocation in which you were called. Because God called you right there. Because He wanted some salt right there. Better to pray that more Christians will join you in that situation until you get the 5% than run away and join a Christian outfit. Well, I just throw that out. I'm a heretic on this, but I'd like to be a heretic. I was talking to a very senior member of our government in the House of Commons 2 days ago, and he told me that he'd prayed about this, and he is now in an office with 3 parliamentary private secretaries, and the other 2 are both Christians, and were both brought in at the last election, new Christian MPs, and the 3 of them are in a senior department of government, and together. That's great. I would think that's about 5% in that particular level of government where they are. They can do something. I was encouraging him to be salt. 5%. I remember talking about this in Parliament. You see, there was a day in the 1960s, early 60s, when I went to visit the members of Parliament prayer meeting in the House of Commons, 70 of them from all parties. That was enough salt. But in the election in the mid-60s, many of them lost their seats. And now there are 2 groups of 9 each praying together out of 600. That's not 5%. And it's interesting, as soon as that 5% disappeared in the mid-60s, very quickly David Steele brought in the abortion law. See? You could see it when the salt got below the amount that was needed to disinfect and fertilize the House of Commons. All the late 60s legislation came in which we're still battling with. Do you follow me? So we need salt in there. We need salt in national government, local government. We need salt in sport. Sport is one of the biggest battlefields of Satan at the moment, because sport is the religion of the men of England. See? And the result is Satan, who is the destroyer, is seeking to use sport to increase violence in society. You can see it happening. And thank God for Christians in sport, people like Gerald Williams, who are really getting in there. And the last time I said this was in Manchester, and I didn't know it, but the manager of one of the Manchester teams was sitting in the congregational audience, and he had in his pocket a letter of resignation. He was fed up with the dirty mess that football was becoming, and he had a letter of resignation in his pocket. And I talked about salt. And at the end of that talk, he tore up the letter. And he went back in to be salt in the name of Jesus. Distribution of salt is very, very important. And the more we shrink back into Christian ghettos, the less that salt can operate. It can only operate in direct contact with the dirt. The third aspect of salt, and perhaps the most important for us, is the aspect of quality. You see, salt is needed in a certain amount in any given situation. It is also needed to be in direct physical contact with the situation it's going to influence. But thirdly, it must be salty. And Jesus talked about salt losing its savor. Now, how can sodium chloride lose its salty quality? The answer is it cannot. It is a physical impossibility. And yet, it must have happened in Jesus' day for him to be able to talk about it. He said, if the salt has lost its savor, it's no good for anything, and men throw it in the street, which is where they threw all their rubbish, and it was trodden underfoot, trodden into the dirt. That's what happens, or did happen, to dirt in the Middle East, or to rubbish. Now, how could salt lose its savor? A very simple way. Not by ceasing to be sodium chloride, but by being adulterated with other substances. And a clever salt dealer would scrape up plenty of sand with the salt from the Dead Sea shores. And so a lot of it was not salt at all. That's the only way in which salt can lose its saltness, by having too much other stuff mixed in with it. And so it loses its quality. And any housewife who bought adulterated salt that was half sand would throw it out of the door into the street. And men would walk it back into the dirt from which it came. Now, the lesson of that is pretty obvious. Christians will only influence the world if they're different from it. Somebody said of the church, the lifeboat should be in the sea, but when the sea gets in the lifeboat, you're in trouble. And in fact, our real situation in England is not just that we don't have enough salt, but that the salt we do have is losing its saltness very, very rapidly by being adulterated, by having too much of the humanist, secularist society around us getting right in among Christians, because we're not willing to wear a tie when everybody else is not. You see what I mean? Because the pressure is enormous to conform. Well, now, it therefore can lose its savor. And Jesus said if it does, all it will do will produce contempt in men. They will treat it with disgust. And I believe we're right in that situation where the church's image is now so dented. The world despises a church that does not stand clear and firm. They would respect us if we were different, even if they didn't like us. But it's because we're playing around with their thoughts, and usually 20 years after they've decided. So we have the rather sad spectacle of Christians trying to be, to quote the Archbishop of Canterbury, we must be credible to our contemporary generation. We called to be credible? Or are we called to be different? That's the real issue. I remember when I was in the Royal Air Force as a chaplain, there was a cartoon stuck up. It showed an RAF chaplain in the bar of the mess, drunk and lying under the table. And two officers were talking, and one said to the other, "What I can't stand about him is his unholier-than-thou attitude." And in fact, that was a way that some of the chaplains tried to get through to be one of the boys. I got some very good advice from a senior chaplain once. There were such things as mess nights. They started well enough with a good dinner, and then they had a good drinking session, and they ended up a mess. I think that's why they call RAF officers' living quarters a mess. But the chaplain's advice to me was, go to the mess night, but leave about 9:30 as quietly as you can. And I thought that was great advice, and I followed it through. In other words, quietly ease out before the thing goes over the line. But the unholier-than-thou attitude, the feeling we've got to be with it, we've got to be one of the boys, we've got to go along with contemporary society or we'll lose them. That is when the salt loses its saltness. And in fact, it's not the way to save society, it's the way to follow it. We should be leading society into a better way, not following their way 30 years after them. And then Jesus said something which I don't think people have taken too seriously. He said, if the salt loses its saltness, there's no way it can be restored. Wherewith shall it be salted again? Now that's important. Once you lose your saltness, you can't get it back again. Once you've lost, when an individual Christian loses their reputation, it's almost impossible to get it back again. The damage done to televangelism in the States is almost irrevocable. Televangelism, I don't think, will recover from that. Once salt loses its saltness, wherewith shall it be salted? It's gone for good. Now then, so what is saltness? Well, we've got to go back to the Beatitudes. And when you read those Beatitudes properly, they are the exact opposite of the attitudes of the world in which we have to live and move. To be poor in spirit is to be despised by the world. It means to lack self-confidence to the point where you say, God, if you don't help me, I can't do it. Now the world admires self-confidence, people who are proud in spirit, people who stand up for themselves, people who say, I can do this. But poor in spirit is the exact opposite. It's to say, hey, this is way beyond me. It's the opposite of self-confidence. It's God-confidence, but it's a lack of self-confidence. To be mourning in a world that loves to be happy and jovial and joking. To weep when others laugh. To be meek. The world, I'm afraid, is an aggressive, competitive meritocracy. And meek people are not going to get very far. People who can be pushed around. People who don't stand up for their rights. And you see, once you're in the kingdom of heaven, you have no rights at all. I've noticed that people who are really salt never use the word rights. Have you noticed that? They don't regard themselves as having rights. They call everything mercies. And then hunger and thirst for righteousness. That means those whose top ambition is to live right. Not to live rich, but to live right. That's their major ambition in life. That kind of person will be salt. Not the person whose ambition it is to be famous or powerful or wealthy. To be merciful in a competitive, cruel, opportunist world. To be merciful, to give others a chance. To be pure in heart not only means to be clean in desires, it means to be unmixed in motives. Not to have ulterior motives. To be motivated by simple, pure motives in what you do in your career. And to be peacemakers rather than fighters. And peacemaking is always costly because it's the peacemaker who is blamed by both parties that you're seeking to reconcile, right? You try to get in between two people at loggerheads, whether in a marriage or in business or whatever, and you try and be the peacemaker, and each will be quite convinced you're taking the other's side. See? And the peacemaker has to be the bearer of the cost of bringing those two together, and he will be blamed, or she will be blamed, for taking the other's side. And yet, somebody's got to take the pain out of that situation. And to be a peacemaker is not a popular job. Now, Jesus was a realist. And when he outlined the character of salt in this way, he realized, he knew from his own experience as well, that this was the surest way to be persecuted. Which is why he adds an extra beatitude. Blessed are you when you are persecuted, when people say all kinds of bad things about you. And he knew that saying, sticks and stones hurt your bones, but names don't hurt at all, that's one of the most untrue proverbs that's ever been coined. What people say does hurt. Hurts deeply. But he said, blessed are you when people say bad things about you. Periodically, this happens to me. It comes in waves, thank God, and there's some relief from time to time. But about 5 years ago, it was particularly bad, and 3 rumors started actually here in Wales. I found out where they started, but they were damaging, and doors of ministry were closing. And people were just writing to say, I'm sorry, arrangements have fallen through. You know, it's amazing how we hide even from fellow Christians while we do things. But anyway, it began to hurt, and I went to the Lord, and I said, Lord, these things they're saying are not true, and they're closing doors of ministry to me. And do you know what the Lord said? He said, David, the worst they can say about you is not as bad as the truth. And do you know, I began to laugh like you did. I laughed. I thought, that is the funniest thing you've ever said to me, Lord. And then he said, and I know the truth, and I still love you, and I still use you. Now, since that day, I've been free of the hurt when people say evil things. And I think, well, thank God they don't know the truth. See? But up till then, it did hurt. It did. And Jesus said, blessed are you when people say all manner of evil against you. Because if you're going to be salt in your situation, this is certain to happen. People will not believe that you have unmixed motives. They can't believe you're doing it for the right reasons. They'll try and... Satan was ever the slanderer and the accuser of the brethren. So Jesus said, if you're going to be salt, it's going to be tough. It will not pay in this world. It will in the next. Great is your reward in heaven. Which means you really have to have faith to believe your reward's going to be big. Because you're not going to see it in this world. So you better accept that. But it's going to be pretty big in the next. Depends where you want your reward, said Jesus. Again and again, he said, if you want a big reward now, you'll have to look to men for it. You'll have to do things in their sight and publicly so they see it. But he said, if men see it, then you'll get your reward from them, but you don't get any reward from my Father. He only rewards what he sees in secret. So, You either keep it to yourself in this world and get a big reward in the next, or you let people see things in this world and you get your reward from men. Which do you want? It's a simple choice, said Jesus. The choice is contempt. What a choice. Contempt or hatred. You either are good salt, in which case you'll get hatred, or you're bad salt and you lose your salt, in which case you get contempt. So I tell you, a Christian loses every way in this world. But if you're real salt, there's a great reward for you in the next. Now, what about light? Light also has its negative and its positive aspects. Its negative aspect is to expose bad ways, to show people up. And that's not the way to popularity either. But it also has a positive function in exhibiting the right way, the better way. So its negative aspect is to show up bad ways. The positive aspect is to exhibit a better way. Neither way will be popular again. Now, this is the only thing Jesus ever said about himself and his disciples. He said, I am the light of the world, you are the light of the world. He didn't say, I am the salt of the earth, but he did say, I am the light of the world. And he said, you are too. And the occasion on which he said it is fascinating. It is in the context of the woman taken in adultery. A story which you probably have never understood. It is a Jewish story, as the Bible is a Jewish book. Happy are you if you have a Jewish friend to teach you the scripture, because a Jew understands it. Now you see, this is the situation. They have caught a woman in the very act of adultery, so they brought him to Jesus, knowing that the law of Moses said she must be stoned, and knowing that Jesus, if he said stone her, would go against the Roman law which forbade execution by Jews. Or if he said don't stone her, then he was going against the law of Moses. In other words, they'd trapped him between the law of Rome and the law of Moses. Do you see? Now then, they hadn't brought the men. And I presume he was around if they caught her in the very act. And they let him off. A bad case of male chauvinism. And I'm afraid society all through the ages has blamed women for immoral relationships, whereas in the Bible God holds the man responsible. Very interesting that. It's one of the things we'll be talking about this afternoon. The man is responsible for a wrong relationship. But they let him off and they brought her. Now then, it is perfectly true that the law of Moses said she must be stoned. So what did Jesus do? He wrote with his finger in the dust. Now to a Jew, that means one thing. That's a claim to be God. It's a claim to be the one who wrote the 10 Commandments with his finger on the stone. It was Jesus saying, I wrote that law. Now Jews would come to that conclusion. We don't when we hear it read in church because we're not Jewish. A finger writing. I hear preachers say, now what did Jesus write? That's not the point. In a vivid act, he's claiming to be responsible for that law, as he did all the way through the Sermon on the Mount, incidentally. Moses, but I say unto you, this is what I meant when I gave that law. This was my intention behind it. And then Jesus reminded them of another law of Moses which they'd forgotten, and that is, it's a very simple law. It says, nobody can be a witness in a criminal charge if they have ever committed the same crime. So when Jesus said, he that is without sin, let him throw the first stone, he did not mean you've got to be 100% morally perfect before you can punish anyone. That's how most Gentiles take it. But you see, that would rule out parents punishing children or police punishing. It would rule out all the law courts. Because no judge is without sin. But he was quoting the law that said, if you have never committed adultery, you can be a witness in this case. And that's when they began to go away, one by one, beginning with the oldest. The young ones tried to brazen it out, but even they had to admit that they'd done it. So in fact, the witnesses were dismissed on the basis of the law. Do you follow me? Then he looked up, he said, where are your accusers? Where are the witnesses? They're all gone? Yes, they've all gone. Now then, another point of the law was that there had to be witnesses, 2 or 3. And of course the case had to be dropped. Jesus said, neither do I condemn you, not out of his own mercy, just because he was not a witness and there were no other witnesses. Case dismissed. Neither do I condemn you. But he said, don't do it again. I might not be around to defend you. If you get into trouble, do get Jesus as your lawyer. I mean, it is a brilliant piece. He was showing, I know the law better than you do. And I'm going to use the very law of Moses to sort out this situation. It's an amazing story. But when she'd gone, and notice he said, now don't do it again. Because mercy is not offered to us to go back into sin, but to stop doing it. He then said to the crowd that had gathered, I am the light of the world. He who follows me won't walk in darkness, but he'll have the light of life. Now that tells us a profound truth about what light is meant to be. It is not what we say or do, it's what we are. What he's saying is that woman would never have got into that situation if she'd followed me. Because that's a situation of darkness, moral darkness. And the man with her, and all the men who accused it, they were all living in darkness. And if you follow me, you don't get into that kind of a mess. It's really a very simple situation. But he had actually shown them all up, hadn't he? He'd shown them all up, exposed their bad ways, and exhibited the better way. Don't do it again. Don't sin anymore. Now then, the only action that we have to do as light is to put ourselves on a bushel. Sorry, not under a bushel, but put ourselves on a lampstand. In other words, there is a responsibility deliberately to put yourself in public view. Now that's a difficult thing for Christians to do. Because hiding your light is no use to anybody else. You may be shining by yourself, but that's not going to help anyone else. Now we sing and we love the song. It's a great song, but I question it. We sing, shine, Jesus, shine. I want to say that Jesus cannot shine in our world because he's not in it. He did shine while he was in it. But one of the reasons he said, you are the light of the world, is because there would come a day when his light would be withdrawn. And the only way he can shine now is through us putting ourselves on a lampstand. Do you follow me? Jesus cannot shine in England today. I keep saying England. I know we're in Wales, but my experience is in England, and that's the nation I see most clearly. Jesus cannot shine in our nation. But you can. Because you've taken over that function. You are the light of the world. Now then, what is it that we have to let shine? And I want to begin negatively by saying there are 3 things that we are not to let shine. 3 things that he's not referring to. First, he is not referring to our devotional activity. That is not to be paraded in public. And he went on in the Sermon on the Mount to say that. Fasting, praying, giving, these are to be done for God alone. And if you ever do it in public, you get mixed motives. And I believe, I just have a strong feeling that it is not right to be parading Christian worship in public. I even question televised services for that reason. Because as soon as we know we're parading, we do it differently. Now, I was up in Newcastle on Tyne, and the ITV were making a program about my ministry at that time. They wanted to come and see me in operation, in meetings in Newcastle on Tyne. I said, on only one condition, and that is that nobody knows you're coming. Now, it took a little bit of discreet organization, but a whole lot of people turned up and found themselves being televised on our TV with no warning at all. The dress was quite different. Isn't that amazing? They hadn't all gone out and bought a new dress and a new hat and had their hair done. It was just an ordinary meeting. The TV cameras just arrived for an ordinary meeting. You see, I think most televised services are shop window. They pack the church, and if you went to that church the next week, it wouldn't be anything like that. See, it's all in the shop window, and there's nothing on the shelf behind. Jesus warned us, that's not what you're to shine before people. Your worship is between you and God. Your prayer life is between you and God. Your fasting, your giving. That's got to be secret. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. So Christians don't want publicity for the money they're giving to things. It produces a mixed motive again. So that's the first negative. We're not to display our devotional life with God. The implications of that are pretty wide. But I ask you to think about them. That's not the light he wanted to be put on a lampstand. That must be put under a bushel, he said. So our devotional life is better not put on show. Secondly, he was not referring to social welfare and do-gooding, because in fact social welfare doesn't convince the world, because the world's pretty good at it too. Now, Christians are to be involved in social welfare. Of course they are. We're told, do good to all men, and especially those of the household of faith. But that's not what Jesus means by letting your light shine, because Bob Geldof can raise as much for famine as any Christian can. And I'm sure you must be aware in your jobs of how many non-Christians selflessly serve the needs. You just watch one of Esther Ranson's Hearts of Gold program. The thing that moves me deeply is how these unbelievers can be so devoted to the welfare of other people. We don't have a monopoly on social action and welfare, believe me. We ought to be involved in it, but that's not what Jesus is talking about when he says you are the light of the world. And if we think it is, then we're not going to make much impact. That doesn't expose others in their bad ways, because many of them are doing it as well. The third negative is, and it's a very popular one this recently, that somehow Christians are to live as if they were poor. You come across this? Living more simply. Now, there's a very delicate balance in this one. Nor are we to be caught up in the materialism and the devotion to possessions. But Jesus is not saying you must all go around in rags and you must all be poor and you must all be vegetarian. Sorry to the vegetarians here. Actually, the Bible talks about those with weak faith not eating meat. Have you ever noticed that in Romans 14? But there we are. Sorry about that. But it's not in that kind of aestheticism or that asceticism that our light is to shine. We are those who know that God gave us freely all things to enjoy. We should enjoy life more than anybody else. And we are free to feast and free to fast. We're free. It is not in a poverty-stricken lifestyle that we're to let our light shine before men, though that is an increasingly popular emphasis. So having cleared those out of the way, there are plenty of others, by the way, who do that latter. There are plenty of Buddhists walking our streets. That's not the way we're to let our light shine. So what is? The answer is, Christians are to be seen for having a higher standard of living than everybody else. But not in material ways, in moral ways. A higher moral standard of living is what Jesus meant. When he said, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good actions. And by good, he didn't mean doing good. He meant being good. And he then proceeds to spell it out in one sphere after another. And he raised moral standards higher than anybody has ever dared to raise them. There is no ethical teacher in the whole of human history dared to say what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And that is why many dismiss it as impracticable and idealistic. And they say it's impossible for anyone to live like that. And it is. It is not natural for anyone to live like this. It is supernatural. Which is why Jesus said, let them see how you live and glorify your Father in heaven. They will say that's not natural. It's not natural. Let me take one example from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus forbade. In fact, he spent more time on this sin than any other in the Sermon on the Mount. He forbade anybody in the kingdom to worry. And this is why you never see a Christian worried. Now, why is it that whenever I say that, it's treated as a joke? Because Jesus didn't mean it as a joke. We treat it like that because we are laughing it off. But he said, worry is forbidden in my kingdom because it is a libel on my heavenly Father. It is saying your Father in heaven cares more about his animals, his pets and his garden than he does about his kids. He clothes the lilies of the field and he looks after the birds of the air. But me, I'm his child, I have to worry. Now, do you see what a libel that is? Why did he spend more time on that than anything else in the Sermon on the Mount? Because he knows how natural it is to worry. It is supernatural not to. Do you understand? What an influence it would be if people said, why is it Christians never worry? In a world that everybody's having to worry about the mortgage and everything else, why is it Christians not worried? Boy, that would be an opener for a testimony, wouldn't it? Why are you never worried? Well, I don't need to. There's a lovely notice outside a church once. It said, why pray when you can worry? I thought that really says something. It's got a bit of humor in it. It's not an old text in Gothic lettering. It really will catch the passerby, that, and make them think. Why pray when you can worry? But it was getting across Sermon on the Mount. Now Jesus said that will be light in the world. That you of all people, as things get worse, and they're going to get worse, you're at peace. Like the little girl in the train traveling alone, and a passenger said to her, aren't you afraid to be traveling all alone? No, because my daddy's the engine driver. It sounds like a preacher's apocryphal story to me, but nevertheless, a little boy said to his daddy, Daddy, was that story true, or was you just preaching? But anyway, but the real thing is, my daddy's the engine driver. See, my Father's running this world, and I'm his child, and therefore he will see that I always have enough to eat and enough to wear. That's the best welfare state in the world. He will not see that I get everything I want, but everything I need, right till my dying day. Who wouldn't want to be in a welfare state like that when the government is scrapping every other bit of welfare? See? But that's Sermon on the Mount. That's light. You see, Jesus fixed moral standards higher than anybody else. But what he then did was he lifted people to the standard. What the church in our country is doing today is lowering the standards to meet the people. Now that's not going to be light or salt. Do you follow me? Let me take 3 examples, all of them in the realm of sex or gender, which is the context in which Jesus first said, I'm the light of the world, so it's all right. But let's take 3. First of all, let's take the ordination of women. Why has it come up now? Why, in the decade of evangelism, when the Church of England was called to reach out and win people for Christ, is it known largely for tearing itself apart over this. If you don't see Satan's hand in this, I don't know whether you'll see it anywhere. But that is what is the image now of the church. Did it come up now because of the Holy Spirit or because of the spirit of the age? You ask yourself that question. Why is it only now that we are discussing the roles and responsibilities of gender? I'll tell you why I believe it. I believe that it's exactly because the spirit of the age is getting in the church. And that issue got to the top of the agenda because of the age in which we live and not because of the Holy Spirit talking to us. If it was of the Holy Spirit, it would have come up years and years ago and the church would have led society. But I see a church following society. Now, you may not agree with me on that. But it's an amazing coincidence that the church is only tearing itself apart over this issue in the very time when it became an issue in the world. Let's take one that is clearer. Practice of homosexuality. Now, the scripture seems to me fairly clear on that one, that we can expect an increase in this. It's a sign when God takes his hands off society, unnatural relationships take over from natural ones. Because when the supernatural is withdrawn, the natural becomes unnatural. You follow me? That's the whole of Romans 1. Why then is the church not speaking clearly on this? Some churches are, and paying the price. The Mayflower Centre in London used to get a £120,000 grant from the local authority for all their welfare work, which is second to none in East London. But since they took a stand against homosexual activity and refused to have such groups on the premises, their grant has been withdrawn and they've had to close down most of their welfare work. Now, that's a church that stood clear, but why is there such ambiguity in the church's clear light on this? The answer is very simple. 1/3 of the clergy, Anglican clergy in London, are practicing homosexuals. And that figure was given on TV in the presence of 2 bishops who didn't deny it, but sought to explain it and excuse it. I'm talking to a lady in private counseling recently, and she said, "David, I'll have to leave my job. I can't stay in it as a Christian." I said, "What's your job?" She said, "I'm the secretary to the principal of a college." I said, "That's a jolly good job. Why do you want to leave that?" She said, "Because 2/3 of the students are gay." And she said, "The atmosphere is terrible." And I said, "Well, I'm afraid you're not in a position to do anything about that. You must talk to the principal and share your difficulties with him." She said, "I have done, but he won't do anything about it." I said, "What kind of college is this?" She said, "A theological college, training men for the ministry." Now, how can you be a light of the world when you're compromised at the heart of it? Let's take one other example in the same realm. We need to separate, I believe, in our thinking, divorce and remarriage. Jesus never said divorce was a sin. He certainly discouraged it very, very strongly. But the New Testament does allow that in certain cases separation is necessary for the sake of peace. Because to God, living at peace with all men is very, very important. But Jesus did say categorically that remarriage after divorce is adultery in God's sight. Now, there's a book just come out last week which I believe every Christian worker who is involved in dealing with divorce and remarriage must read. It will send a shockwave through the Christian community of this country. It's by Andrew Corns, the vicar of Crowborough. It's just simply called Divorce and Remarriage. It's a biggie. It's about 600 pages. It's published by Hodder and Stoughton. And to my mind, it's the best thing I've read on the subject, and I've got a shelf full. I know it's one of the biggest pressures on pastors today dealing with family situations like this. But you hardly ever hear that teaching of Jesus stated in Christian circles, that remarriage is adultery. And by that teaching, Margaret Thatcher was living in adultery. So was her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson. So is the new Home Secretary, Michael Howard. But the church doesn't speak out on this. Why not? Now you see, it's gone terribly quiet in this room because here's an area where the church is lowering standards to meet the people. And I urge you to get Andrew Corn's book and really look at it very carefully before you allow yourself to be sucked into the relativism on this issue, where if one church says one thing, you can just go down the road and find a church that says the opposite. And there is no clear light shining on this issue. I've given you these examples to spell it out, that the church is at the moment lowering the standards to meet the people, or as George Carey says, to become credible to our contemporaries. That means the light can go out. And Jesus was quite clear that being light is going to be terribly unpopular, because he went on to say, I'm the light of the world. He went on to say, and because I am, you hate me and you want to kill me. And he knew perfectly well that being light is a very costly thing. And standing for what you know to be right and true will be painful and profoundly unpopular. And yet that is what it is to be light in the world of darkness. Oh, my time has gone. It's 11 o'clock. I'm halfway through. I'll continue tomorrow morning. But I hope I've left you with a sense that salt and light are not what you do or say, but what you are. And they only operate when you're in direct physical contact with a world that's in darkness and dirt. And we need a certain amount if it's going to operate. And we need, above all, a quality of salt and a quality of light that is totally different from the society in which God has placed us. We'll pick that up tomorrow morning and take it just a step further.